All right, now moving into kind of a unique region where we have two countries from different continents. Or two regions from different continents coming together to make one. So North Africa and Southwest Asian. That's what your discussion question is, kind of looking at why that would be so. So looking at those geographic features, again, things that connect them to make up this region, their colonization, and reasons that conflict is so prominent in this region. So first of all, just where we are looking at. So again, here in North Africa, so above the Sahara, so we covered the sub-Sahara Africa. So again, North Africa, think about like Egypt, Libya, Morocco, but then also Southwest Asia, which is more of what we think about whenever we talk about the Middle East. So talking about Iran, Afghanistan, Yemen, Kuwait, Israel, Iraq, Turkey. So all of these countries coming together to make up this region, even though, again, covering a couple different continents, but considered one region. If we look at the climate, of course, the Sahara Desert being very dry, same into the Middle East. So again, a lot of deserts, a lot of dry conditions due to, again, the being above the equator, to where we have those high and low systems coming in, bringing a lot of rain to the equator, but then above that region, having more dry environments and less rainfall. So again, thinking about the region here, thinking about some of those prevailing beliefs. So we see that mainly in this region is a lot of Islam, which is the most common religion. Christianity being in a lot of other regions around the world. Again, as we look at some of the other Asian regions, we have Buddhism and Hinduism being more common in those regions, but Muslim, again, predominating in this region we're covering now. So that leads then to the culture. So again, typically with Muslims, thinking about women with their heads covered, being under the dominion of men. Thinking about a lot of military, a lot of mosque. Again, religion and the Muslim religion being very important to their culture. So some of the physical geography and a video here that kind of summarizes a lot of this and shows it. So again, that's Sahara Desert, the Arabian Desert, so very dry, as we just mentioned with the climate. The Nile River Delta that provides a lot of agricultural support to this region. The Atlas Mountains, the Zagros Mountains, and then we'll talk about some choke points here as well. So the Sahara Desert, again, thinking about the northern part being very, very dry, Libya, Egypt, into that area, again, away from the water in a very dry environment. Doesn't necessarily mean cold, hot. So we see the snow here in the desert as well, but again, very dry. The Arabian Desert, more moving into like Iraq, Saudi Arabia. So again, very dry regions. It is the third largest desert on that Arabian Peninsula, just east of the Red Sea that we see here. Then the Nile River Basin, so into Africa, so starting here at the Nile River, so the delta, which is going to provide a lot of water and agriculture, but then as we move down, we still get some resources and water supply to this region along the Nile. So it's where it spreads out and drains into that Mediterranean Sea. Again, a lot of population here, probably the most as far as Africa here, about 40 to 50 million people. Cairo is kind of that, Cairo is one of the more modern cities in that region, and it has a very fast growing population. And unfortunately, it's not enough to support, that can be supported by the agricultural land, so there's also a lot of famine in the region. So it's losing about 2% of that arable land, though, per decade due to, again, climate change or just the misuse of the land. And about 15% of the usable farmland has been damaged, again, by that increased sea level and saltwater intrusion, again, back to our climate change. So there are lots of efforts to try and use the deserts for farmland to pump the groundwater in those regions to provide support. Then if we look at the Atlas Mountains that are over more toward Morocco, so this are kind of related to the Appalachian Mountains because they were actually once part of the same mountain range. So again, thinking about the Pangea, when we were all connected, again, the Atlas Mountains were actually part and formed at the same time as the Appalachian Mountains. So this provides a natural resources that are rich there due to the higher elevation, again, also closer to the water, so a little bit more rainfall, not as desert and dry, so lots of agriculture for this region, including iron, lead, copper, silver, coal, and natural gas. And this is just kind of showing, again, the connection here between these, the Appalachian and the Atlas Mountains, again, once connected during Pangea. And this is showing some of that agriculture. So again, even though it's steep, they use kind of that step farmland. So they use the steep elevation, they level off in kind of a staircase to allow vegetation to occur. Now the Zagros Mountains is more in Iraq that we can see here. So this large mountain range that goes between Iraq and Iran. It is very tectonically active and still growing, but of course very small. So it remains about 10 Neanderthal men and women were actually discovered in Shandahar cave in 1951 and 1960, so which is located in Iraq. And actually one was covered in flowers, showing the kind of burial ceremonies that would have taken place. The Tigris and Euphrates river system, very important to this area. So they cover Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, empties into that Persian Gulf, makes up this Mesopotamia area here, which is the land between the rivers. So that early human geography in that Fertile Crescent is what this is referred to as, where, again, kind of the humans are thought to have originated. So the birthplace to writing and recorded history, time, the oldest political and administrative system seen in this area. Again, due to that Fertile Crescent, is named that because of the rich soils that occur in that Mesopotamia between those two rivers. However, it is decreasing in size due to water drainage, but also pollution of those water sources. Also, it was drained in the 1990s trying to flush out rebels against Saddam Hussein's government that are still having negative impacts today. All right, so then the other thing we want to talk about here are these choke points. And what is referred to here as a choke point? So this would be a point talking about shipping routes in which they have to pass through this small region. So again, it could be choked out. So we talk about like the Panama Canal, where we're connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, but it's a small area. So whoever owns it has a lot of power as far as gains from thinking about economic gains, but also can lead to a lot of conflict. And we can see a lot of these choke points in our transportation all center in this North Africa, Southwest Asia area. So they become very important in controlling shipping routes, which again impacts their economy, but also can cause a lot of conflicts globally. All right, now moving into our colonialization. So what we have here, so after World War I, the Middle East had provided, was divided among those select European countries. So again, we can see kind of the different European players that were involved. So Britain, France, and Italy. The borders were drawn with little regard, though, to religious and ethnic differences, more about their resources. So they ended up dividing up these countries, not thinking about what would join these individuals together to create a good system. So again, unfortunately, this has led to a lot of conflict because these new countries rejected colonialism and they fought for their independence. And most of their countries have now gained it around by about 1950. Now, Israel and Palestine, of course, a lot going on in that region right now. So that conflict started around the 1900s. Palestine was mainly Muslim and Christians, and then some Jews. The Jewish people, though, began immigrating to Palestine early in the 1900s. The British mandate for Palestine between the World War I and II occurred where more Jewish immigration increased the tension between the Jews and the Arabs in that region. So then after the Holocaust and after World War II, the United Nations divided Palestine into Israel and Palestine. And Israel was for the Jewish people and Palestine for the Muslims or the Arabian people. So they were separated based on their religion. However, as we're seeing now, lots of different wars since that resolution, because again, neither one necessarily wanted to be separated, even though they didn't want to come together. But again, just who is dominating or controlling those lands and those resources. Now, the economy in the land, of course, we think a lot about with the Persian Gulf War in Saudi Arabia. A lot of it comes back to oil. So a lot of oil resources are dominated in this region. There is, though, a lot of regional inequality. So the Gulf countries are very wealthy due to that petroleum reserve, which is named due to that coastline on the Persian Gulf. So those countries make up about 15% of the Middle East population, but more than half, or about half, of the income. So while not a huge number of people live there, they definitely bring in the majority of the income. So there's a large disparity, though, between the earnings of the top 10% and the middle 40%, which again leads to a lot of conflict. So not equally distributing that wealth or the money coming in from those resources. So just looking kind of at that inequality of the Middle East as being some of the most unequal in the places. So we think about the bottom 50% compared to the top 10%. So we see this in the United States as well. So where the wealthy is very wealthy and the poor are very poor. But again, South Africa having the largest difference than the Middle East coming in with them, where we see some less inequalities, more like Western Europe, to where that wealth seems to have been more equally distributed.